The evening was supposed to be special. I had been looking forward to this gathering with friends, this little break from my worries. After a week filled with stress and sleepless nights, this was my chance to just relax, forget about time, and escape from everyday problems. I had prepared my favorite dish, set the table, and chosen candles to create a cozy atmosphere. Everything was ready. But when I picked up the phone to check if everything was fine with the guests, I received a message that immediately threw me off balance. One of my friends couldn't come, and another one suddenly got sick. The impossibility of spending the evening as I had planned hit me like a thunderclap on a clear day. I couldn't believe my plans were shattered in an instant. Usually I wouldn't have been this upset, but this time I felt as if all hope for something good, something I had been waiting for, had left me. Everything seemed empty, unreal. I tried to pull myself together, but the sense of emptiness was too overwhelming. I sat in silence, alone in the room where joy was supposed to reign. But instead, I simply felt how my mood melted away, how the candles dimmed, and the dinner became a reminder that I was left alone with the void. As I sat on the couch, still unable to fully process what had happened, the door quietly opened. I looked up and saw Robert, my old friend. He stood in the doorway with his familiar smile, the kind that could always dissolve any heaviness in my soul. He was one of those people with whom you didn't need to explain much. We hadn't seen each other in a while, but his presence seemed to fill the emptiness in the room. "Hey, how are you?" he asked, walking in and immediately noticing my distressed state. His voice was soft, full of care, and I could feel his attention enveloping me, without unnecessary words or fuss. I tried to hide my emotions, but he had already figured it out. I don't know how he did it, but Robert had always been able to read me like an open book. He sat down next to me, not asking anything unnecessary, simply waiting for me to decide when I was ready to speak. "What happened?" His voice was warm and calm, as though he wasn't expecting anything dramatic, but still ready to listen. I didn't respond right away, searching for the right words. On one hand, I didn't want to talk about how my little plans had fallen apart. But on the other, I couldn't hide the disappointment from him. He had always been someone I could just be myself with, without pretense. And so I began speaking, not worrying about how it might sound. "My friends canceled the gathering," I said, as if it were something trivial. I had been looking forward to this evening, and now, well, I paused, feeling the weight of the words hanging in the air. Robert nodded silently. He understood. He was there, not trying to comfort me, but his presence suddenly became exactly what I had been missing. And in that moment, amidst the simplicity, I felt something begin to shift inside me. Robert sat beside me, and his silence felt so natural. He didn't rush to ask questions or try to comfort me. He simply sat there, and that was enough. But in the quiet warmth of his presence, I began to realize how long it had been since I had experienced such simple moments. With my husband, we didn't talk about things like this. It seemed like everything was as it had always been. The daily routine, caring for the house, the children, making plans for the future. But we lived like that, on autopilot from day to day. I often felt that we were no longer partners, but just two people who had exchanged their best years for obligations and habit. Every conversation with him seemed to spiral into simple phrases and short requests. "Buy some milk? Did you pick up the kids from school?" And that was it. The time we spent together had become blurred, dull, devoid of the connection that once bound us. I couldn't remember the last time we simply sat and talked, laughing, exchanging endless thoughts. We were so caught up in everything else that we forgot how to be real with each other. Sometimes it seemed like he didn't even notice how much I missed those simple yet important conversations. Robert's care, his genuine interest in my feelings, made me realize just how deep I had sunk into this trap of loneliness. But at the same time, there came a surprising realization that even with him, after all these years, it was still possible to be real. And that awakened something in me that I had long forgotten. The need to be heard, to feel important to someone. When I paused in my thoughts, Robert seemed to understand that I needed more than just silence. He leaned slightly forward, and his gaze was so soft that I felt something inside me soften as well. If you'd like, I can keep you company, he said, his voice quiet but confident. I don't want to impose, but if you need just a little time to distract yourself, I'm here. I could have said no or even smiled and told him I needed to be alone, but there was something so genuine in his offer that I couldn't refuse. I looked at him, not understanding how everything between us could be so easy. As though time hadn't passed, and our conversations were still as natural as they had always been. Do you really want to do this? I asked, not hiding the doubt in my voice. You're not obligated. Obligated? Robert laughed, as if it was strange to hear. Have you forgotten that I've always been there when you needed support? You know I can be helpful. I couldn't help but smile, though a light anxiety still lingered in my heart. It seemed to me that his help was something more than just support in a moment of disappointment. It felt like a thread that suddenly connected me to a world I had long forgotten. He got up and offered me a cup of tea. His small gesture, such simple care, seemed to pull me out of the haze of loneliness. He wasn't trying to solve my problems, nor was he offering any grand answers. He was simply there, and that became something meaningful. When the cup of tea was in my hands, I felt Robert looking at me with such gentle kindness that I became a little embarrassed. I felt how this evening, which had started with emptiness, suddenly filled with something real. I didn't know what would come next, but in that moment, I realized how important it was to allow myself to feel supported, even if it came unexpectedly. As I held the cup of tea in my hands, I felt its warmth, but inside me there was still a cold sense of uncertainty. I knew I needed time to process all these emotions, but for some reason, in that moment, I couldn't shake the thought that something was starting to change. I sat on the couch, trying to justify to myself what was happening between Robert and me. After all, he was just a friend, an old friend I hadn't seen in a while. There was nothing extraordinary about it. I was upset, and he offered me support. That should have been completely normal, right? But somehow, deep down, I felt a growing unease. Everything seemed so simple, so natural. But every word, every movement of Robert's touched some unexplored depths inside me. I tried to focus on something else, like how he quietly went about preparing another cup of tea for himself. But somehow, even in this simple act, I saw something that made me feel self-conscious. It was all too easy, too sincere. You can't let yourself think about him anymore, I kept telling myself. But despite my efforts, my thoughts kept returning to how I felt when I was around him. How easily we could talk about things that weren't being discussed at home with my husband. How his care made me feel important. How it seemed like he understood me without words. I tried to resist, but it seemed like it was already too late. I realized I could no longer go back. My own decision not to rely on Robert, not to let myself be vulnerable, now seemed less important. This was something more than just friendship. And I knew I could no longer hide it. With each passing moment spent with him, I felt myself losing control more and more. You can't let yourself do this, I kept telling myself. But the feelings were growing stronger. When Robert looked at me and smiled, something in his gaze changed. I understood that at some point this had become important to me. Too important. Robert kept talking, but I barely heard his words. My entire focus was on the feelings he stirred inside me. His simple presence, his soft words, his genuine interest in my thoughts and emotions, all of it suddenly became something important to me. Almost essential. I couldn't shake the thought of how long it had been since I felt like I was the center of someone's attention. How long it had been since I was important to someone, since I invoked a need, since someone cared. The last time, perhaps, was at the beginning of my relationship with my husband, when he couldn't take his eyes off me. But since then, day by day, worries, duties, and daily routines had overshadowed all those moments when I was someone special to another person. And now, sitting next to Robert, I suddenly felt how his attention filled me with warmth. I could have said that it was just a friendly relationship, that there was nothing special between us. But for some reason, this evening, this conversation, everything was changing. I could no longer ignore how easy it was to be with him, how pleasant it felt to have him by my side, to feel that he understood me. His care, his ability to listen, without any unnecessary intrusion, was exactly what I had been missing. I didn't know what this was, but I began to realize that with him, I didn't feel alone. It was a simple yet important revelation. I didn't always have to be strong. I didn't have to constantly carry the burden of responsibility and care. I could allow myself to be vulnerable, to feel like I was important and needed. And this discovery was significant for me. When Robert spoke again, his words were so simple and sincere that I couldn't help but smile. I didn't know why exactly his words affected me so deeply, but I felt at some point on the edge of this light conversation that my feelings were starting to change. I remembered how long it had been since I felt like I mattered. How long it had been since I received such simple yet profoundly important gestures of attention. And maybe that's exactly what he was for me. A reminder that it's important to remember that you're not alone. Time seemed to slow down. I couldn't exactly say when it happened, but with each hour spent with Robert, my feelings became clearer. We sat on the couch, talking about the past, sharing memories and experiences, laughing. I was surprised at how effortlessly everything flowed. There was no need for complicated explanations or questions. All of our conversations, like old, familiar habits, returned, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was once again part of something important. It was strange. At first, I was simply seeking a distraction to forget and escape the disappointment. But the longer I spent with Robert, the clearer it became that I enjoyed being with him, that I felt comfortable and safe beside him. I couldn't understand when exactly this reevaluation began, but it was unmistakable. With each passing minute, I felt that something was growing within me that shouldn't have been. The ease with which we communicated, the certainty that he understood me, became important to me, even though I tried to deny it. Something inside me resisted these new emotions. I tried to understand why I was reacting this way, why I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between us. Robert, it seemed, didn't notice. He continued to be himself, attentive, kind, and it felt so natural that I started to doubt my own feelings. Was it really possible to so easily and quickly grow accustomed to being with someone you hadn't seen in so long? Or maybe I just missed having real conversations, those moments when you can simply be yourself, not worrying about anything? I felt that tension inside me again, as if there was something I needed to resolve, but I couldn't figure out what exactly. Was there something more between us than just friendship? And if so, what was I supposed to do with it? Several hours passed, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that was growing stronger within me. We continued talking, laughing, but deep down I could feel my emotions swirling around me like a whirlwind. I tried to focus on what was happening around me, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Robert, to what he meant to me now. Why was this affecting me so deeply? Why had I become so attached to his presence? I couldn't understand. We were talking as old friends, but for some reason, in his words, I felt something more than just friendly involvement. His smile, his gaze, his quiet but meaningful words. Everything seemed so natural, yet I couldn't help but wonder. Had I become too attached to this person? My head was starting to fill with doubts. I tried to push these thoughts away, telling myself that this was just old feelings resurfacing because Robert was there in a moment when I was struggling. We hadn't seen each other in years. That didn't mean I could start feeling something more. I tried to justify my reactions, convincing myself that it was simply friendly excitement, that I was overanalyzing, that I shouldn't be so concerned. But the thought of how easy it was to be with him, how our conversations flowed freely, without effort, wouldn't leave me. There was something in his confidence, in the way he always knew what to say, that made me uneasy. Something I couldn't ignore. My thoughts were tangled. I was starting to feel a bit lost. It became overwhelming. I could no longer hide my thoughts and feelings, but I couldn't figure out what to do with them either. It was all becoming too complicated, like I was standing at a crossroads, not knowing which path to take. I didn't know what to do. The hours dragged on slowly, and with each passing moment, my doubts and emotions became more unbearable. Robert sat beside me, but I could feel the distance growing between us. Not physically, but in my mind. I could no longer ignore what was happening, and it seemed like he felt it too. We both remained silent, and the silence became heavy. I didn't know how to return to the ease we once had. The time we had spent together was too important to simply forget. I felt something significant changing inside me, as if something I had long hidden was slowly surfacing. When Robert looked at me again, I saw something in his eyes that seemed to be reading my thoughts. He didn't say a word, but his gaze was so deep that I couldn't tear my eyes away. He knew. He knew my feelings had changed, and maybe he was feeling something too. It was obvious, but neither of us dared to break the silence. At that moment, I felt something inside me snap. I could no longer pretend that everything was fine, that everything was normal. I realized that this evening had become a turning point for me, that I couldn't just put everything back the way it was. I couldn't return to my old state, ignoring these feelings. Robert spoke again, his voice quiet, but with a kind of resolve, as if he had finally made up his mind about something that had long been building. "Are you okay?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it sounded like there was so much more hidden behind it than just concern. He seemed to know that it wasn't just about the canceled dinner. I was silent, unsure of what to say. I wasn't okay. I felt the air in the room grow thick, as though everything around me had become too sharp and too real. I knew this evening couldn't just end like this. I couldn't be the same person I was before. Feelings I hadn't expected had surfaced, and I could no longer ignore them. The silence stretched, but I knew it wouldn't last long. Something important had already changed in my relationship with Robert, and I could no longer deny it. The next morning, as I returned to reality, all the events of that evening were still swirling in my mind. Robert had left late, and although I felt relief that my feelings had become clearer, something inside me still felt unfinished. With each minute spent in silence, I realized more and more that this meeting had become something more than just a conversation with a friend. My husband returned home, and I greeted him with my usual smile, trying to hide the anxiety that had tightened around my heart. He was the same as always, attentive, caring, but all of it now seemed less significant than before. I saw how he was genuinely curious about how my evening had gone, but somewhere inside me, a growing chasm had already begun to develop. I couldn't help but notice how difficult it was to answer his questions. He didn't know what had happened, didn't know that I had gone through something more than just the disappointment of a canceled dinner. I felt that, despite all his care, something insurmountable had arisen between us, something that could not be hidden. That evening with Robert, those simple but meaningful moments, had become something I couldn't just forget. I couldn't go back to what things were like before, and this realization weighed on me heavily. I could no longer pretend that everything was fine. Something inside me had shifted. My husband continued speaking, but I could no longer focus on his words. I tried to keep up with the conversation, tried to maintain normalcy, but everything inside me was screaming that I was no longer the same. I knew I couldn't hide from him what had begun to change inside me, but I didn't know how to tell him. I didn't know how to explain that this evening with Robert had changed something important in my perception, and now I couldn't return to that safe zone where everything was familiar. It was a strange and unsettling realization. It was like I was standing at a threshold, not knowing where to go next. I couldn't turn back, and at the same time, I didn't know how to move forward. It was all too new, too unexpected. But I understood that one day I would have to choose. I sat by the window, watching as the city sank into silence. The street was empty, and in its emptiness, I felt as though my entire life had frozen at the edge of a choice. I could no longer continue living in the state I had been in before that evening. Robert, his presence, his attention, All of it had turned something in my perception. But now I was faced with the question, what to do with this newfound awareness? My husband sat on the couch, reading the newspaper, as always, his attention entirely absorbed in something external. He didn't know what was happening inside me. He didn't know that this evening had been a turning point, that something had shifted, even though it wasn't directly related to him. I could feel his world continuing to turn, while I stood at the edge with one foot on the other side. I could have continued as before, hiding my feelings, trying to return to the familiar routine. But was that honest? Was I ready to keep playing the role of a person I wasn't, just to preserve things as they were? Or was I supposed to admit that in this situation I had changed, and that perhaps it was time to acknowledge that I couldn't live in this endless cycle of mundanity, denying something important for myself? In that moment, I suddenly felt a sense of relief. The night outside hid all my uncertainties, but it gave me a chance to see that the answers to my questions had long been inside me. All that remained was to make a decision and move forward. Into the unknown, but honestly. I turned to my husband, looked at him as someone with whom I had shared many years, but at the same time I knew in my heart that another conversation had already begun. The conversation that no longer made sense to continue if I couldn't be honest with myself. I took a deep breath, feeling determination fill me. Running away no longer made sense. I knew that if I didn't speak now, this would continue endlessly, like a closed loop. The words caught in my throat, but I forced myself to say them. We need to talk. My husband looked up from the newspaper, surprised, his eyes showing no worry, just mild confusion. I didn't often speak so seriously. About what? He asked, putting the paper aside. I felt my heart pounding loudly. How to say it? How to explain? How to not hurt him while also not betraying myself? I hesitated, searching for the right words. I've been thinking a lot about us, about what we've become. He furrowed his brows, now a hint of concern flickered in his eyes. What do you mean? I looked out the window. The city was dark, the streets empty. I felt as empty as them. When was the last time we were truly close? Not just living together, not just discussing household matters, but actually being there for each other? He straightened up as if these words had hit him harder than he intended to show. I don't understand where you're going with this. I mean, I said, my voice trembling slightly. I feel like we've lost something important, and I can't ignore it anymore. A heavy silence fell. It was so tense that the air in the room seemed to thicken. He was silent for a long time, as if considering my words, then asked, Is this about someone else? A wave of panic washed over me. He felt it immediately. I didn't want this to be about Robert. It wasn't just about him. He had simply helped me see something I had long hidden from myself. No, I replied softly. It's about us. About how we've stopped being who we were. He looked wounded, but not angry. I didn't know you felt this way. His voice was even, but there was pain in it. I didn't understand it myself for a long time, I admitted. I didn't want to pressure him, didn't want to start a scene. All I wanted was honesty. I didn't know where this conversation would lead us, but I knew one thing for certain. I could no longer stay silent. He sat across from me, staring at a single point as if trying to find the answer to everything he had just heard in it. His face showed no anger, but there was pain in his eyes. Maybe he had felt something like this for a long time, just preferred not to acknowledge it. Are you trying to say that nothing can be fixed? His voice sounded hollow. I looked away. I didn't want to hurt him, but I knew that if I lied now, it would only prolong the inevitable. I don't know, I answered honestly. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I can't pretend anymore that nothing is happening. He ran his hand over his face as if trying to rid himself of the sudden weight that had fallen on him. This happened unexpectedly. He spoke slowly, carefully choosing his words. I thought everything was fine. Yes, we didn't talk much. Yes, we got used to each other. But isn't that normal? People live together for a long time and just get used to each other. Isn't that okay? I clenched my fingers into a fist. Habit is not the same, I said quietly. He looked at me and I saw something in his eyes that hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't irritation, not outrage, but fear. You're not planning on leaving, are you? I froze. I knew that this question would come sooner or later, but I didn't expect him to ask it so quickly. A wave of anxiety surged inside me. What could I answer? I don't know. That was the only honest answer I could give. After that conversation, something between us broke. We lived under the same roof, but I felt that something irreversible had changed. The conversation hung between us like a heavy fog that couldn't be cleared. He didn't get angry, didn't cause scenes, didn't demand explanations. He simply withdrew into himself. Sometimes I caught him looking at me, but there was no longer the familiar softness in his gaze, only confusion. I could tell he was trying to understand where exactly things had gone wrong, but probably deep down he already knew the answer. And me? I couldn't pretend that nothing was happening either. Robert hadn't come by anymore, but we exchanged messages, just neutral ones, but there was something in them that made me feel alive. I replayed that evening over and over in my mind. Our conversations, his warm words, his understanding. How easy and peaceful it felt to be around him. I didn't know if it was right, but every time I thought of him, everything inside me flipped. I tried to keep myself together, telling myself that it was just a temporary shock. But something inside me had already made a decision, one that I was even afraid to voice aloud. A week went by. My husband continued to act as if everything was fine, but I knew it wasn't. We both knew it. We didn't fight. We didn't confront each other. We simply became two people living under the same roof, but having nothing in common anymore. One day, I received a message from Robert. Can we meet? I stared at the phone screen for a long time. I knew that if I agreed, this would be the final point. It would be a step after which there would be no turning back. I hesitated for a long time, but eventually I wrote, yes. I sat in the cafe, nervously gripping my cup of coffee. My heart pounded in my chest, my fingers trembling. I didn't know why I was there, what I wanted to hear, what I wanted to resolve. Robert entered, saw me, and smiled. It was that same smile that always made me feel like everything would be okay. Hi, he said, sitting down across from me. I looked at him and realized that my world had completely divided into before and after. Hi, I whispered. And in that moment, I knew that I had already made my choice. I returned home late. The city lights streaked across the windows of the car, turning the streets into blurred ribbons of light. Inside, chaos reigned. The conversation with Robert had turned everything upside down, although, to be honest, everything had changed long before this meeting. We had sat in the cafe for hours, talking, but between the words, something bigger hid. Something that couldn't be said aloud, but was clear in every glance, every moment of silence between our sentences. You're unhappy, he said quietly at one point, and I couldn't find the words to argue. I just remained silent, staring into my coffee cup, while he studied my face. I don't know what to do, I finally whispered. You already know. He looked me straight in the eyes. You're just afraid to admit it. And he was right. I walked to the door of my apartment, knowing that behind it waited the familiar world, a world I could no longer call my own. My husband was sitting in the living room, bent over his phone. When I entered, he looked up and studied me, for a long time, with focus. Did you meet with him? He asked. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. Yes, I answered honestly. Silence filled the space between us. And? His voice was even, but there was so much strain in it that I was suddenly scared. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't. All I could do was look at him. So it's true, he said, rubbing his face tiredly. I felt like we were losing each other, but I never thought it would go this far. I closed my eyes. I'm sorry. Sorry? He gave a bitter smile. If you were really sorry, you wouldn't have gone there. I didn't know what to answer. Do you love him? That question hit me harder than I expected. I couldn't answer. Not now. He stared at me for a few more moments, then sighed heavily and turned away. I'm tired, he said simply and left the room.